Hi guys, and welcome back to the next lesson of our Blenders for Production series about 2D and 3D tracking inside of Blender. My name is Holger Maus from pixeltrain. After we've seen now many use cases of tracking inside of Blender, I now want to dive deeper into the advanced settings of the tracker module. So for this, I've prepared some image sequences from our trainings data. And if you want to follow along exactly with the same trainings data, you find these trainings data on my Gumroad and also in my Patreon. But feel free to use your own footage because this helps you also to learn. So the Gumroad and the Patreon is a kind of way of saying thank you, but I'm also appreciate if you subscribe and give me a thumbs up. So let's get started. We go directly here into the VFX template, into the movie clip editor. And I load now here my first sequence from the trainings data. And this is quite an easy one. It's named Brunnen. Let's take a look here. You see I've only extracted a chunk of the whole clip. So I only used frame 1 to 200. That's enough. And I load now this image sequence here into the movie clip editor. Then we do always the same. We check for the color management. No, it's filmic. So we have to go to standard, look none. That's nice. Then we go into the frame rate. Maybe let's try 25. Let's test that. I think set scene frames prefetch. This maybe is a 30 frames, but no, 25. Looks good for me. So let's take 25 here. So we set up everything correctly so that we can start. Let's press Command S for saving. And we say this here is tracking Brunnen. Okay, version 001. So this scene is not complicated at all. It's only meant for learning a little bit about these options, but stay, we will have more complicated footage in a moment. What I want to do is I want to track here a feature, and if we go here to play, you will see I walk a little bit towards this Brunnen or well here, and I also rotate a little bit around it. What I want to try now is I want to have this pattern here as a tracking target. So let's go to the first frame, shift left arrow, and you remember that the settings for the tracker before you generate it is on the left side here. So we talked about the search pattern and the search size, so these two options should be familiar. And now we want to talk about these here. So I don't change them at all at the moment because you know that after we generated a tracker, we can change the marker or the track for itself always here on the right side. So that's exactly what we now want to do. So let's go closer to the pattern and I control click here to set this tracker here. And then I press the S key to scale the pattern here up. You also can now decide which point you want to track. If we have later motion blur or things like that, it's sometimes quite hard to place something here in the wild. So it's always good to have a reference point for yourself. And in this pattern here, which I want to track, I think this opening here at the top is quite good. So I place myself here by the help of this pattern window here, exactly here in the middle of this opening. And you see that the pattern this time is quite big because I think this here makes a good pattern to track. If you want, you can check your search area with Alt S. You see the search area here is also quite big, but it's okay. It's only a test, so Alt S again. I lock my view here with the L key onto this pattern now, and now we can start tracking. So let's check first the options which we have. So let's go here to the right. This window here is now clear. I think we talked about that before. And here in the tracking settings here are now exactly the same settings like here. Let's check now what we see here. The first thing we now can talk about is the so-named motion model. And this is quite an interesting one because this pattern here has to be found in every frame which now the tracker goes into. Depending on your movement of the camera, this pattern is changing. You will see that in a moment. So let's go to the speed, set it to real time. This is something we talked about before, and also the correlation is interesting. The correlation I set to 0.9. So what is correlation? Correlation means how close has the pattern to be that it's recognized as a pattern. You remember, tracking means that in the next frame, this exact pattern here is searched inside of this area here. This pattern always changes. You have lighting conditions, you move your camera, the pixel raster is a little bit different, so it looks a little bit different, and so we never have an exact pattern again, and this is named a correlation. So with 0.9, I only tell the system I need from the tracker that you are to 90% sure that this is the pattern. So 90% is much higher than the default of 70%. We can try if it finds it. If it doesn't find it, the tracking process will stop. Let's test. So I press Command T. You also can go here to the tracking buttons, but yeah, we talked about that. And now you see the tracker is moving, and then suddenly it stops. It stops here in frame 64. So let's check what the problem here is. You see, I'm moving now in direction of this pattern here. I come closer and closer. You can see here exactly what Blender sees. The pattern here is still quite good. So it looks nearly the same, 90%, you remember. But then I start walking, and now the pattern is changing. And suddenly it says, okay, it looks different. It can be that due to the fact that I came closer to the pattern is now bigger. Also, I moved a little bit the camera to the left or the right, and maybe also we have a little bit of motion blur, which also changed the pattern. And to prevent that, we have some options now here. The first one is the Sonnet motion model. You see that this pattern area here stays always in the same direction. You see, it doesn't rotate, change or everything. But if we now go farther away, you will see that now suddenly I look a little bit from the side to the pattern and so on. So what we can do now, let's go back here to the first frame and delete everything we had. We can tell now through the motion model here on the tracker that we not only want to track the location of this point, but also rotation. That means now that this pattern is allowed to also rotate itself. Sounds interesting. Let's check this. Control T again. And now you see we come a little bit farther here, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is now here. You see that the pattern suddenly now starts to rotate. So Blender has seen now that this pattern is still there, but it's rotating in the plate. And this is something this motion model location and rotation can check for you. It takes longer, because it has to make more tests, but it finds it better. Now comes to the point that these motion models are really stacked. So location was the fastest one, but it only checks where the pattern is, but the pattern is not allowed to rotate at all. Then we have rotation and location, but we also have maybe location and scale. Maybe we go straight to the pattern. So the pattern stays in the rotation thing, but it scales up or down. So maybe this is the case, but in our case we have everything. So location, rotation and scale. This maybe is a good solution. Let's go back here to our first frame, delete everything again, and the pattern is again here at the starting point, and now we press track again, Command T. Now you see we end here in this frame. And if you now take a close look here to the pattern, and we also can read numbers if you like that. So let's make this window a little bit bigger. So if you go here to the marker, you can read here a little bit what on the marker is going on. And you see that the width of the pattern is changing. We haven't changed the width at all. We haven't scaled it. So this is like a bounding box. And so you see, yes, this is a rotation and also maybe a little bit of scale. I don't know. We don't see it exactly here, but you see, yeah, it is changing. Now, I think you understood these motion models here, but we have two more motion models. The next one is affine, and the last one, the most complicated one and the slowest one, but the best one here is perspective. You can go to Affine and read a little bit about this method. So it searches for a marker that are affine deformed, so translation, rotation, but also skew. So we have a little bit of a skewing going on in this pattern, and this sometimes helps enough in also perspective changes. If we go now here to perspective, and you see this is a full perspective deformed pattern. So we can test both, and this is also something I do in practice a lot. It's not said that perspective is always giving you the better result. Affine is quite good, so let's test it. Okay, now you see, works nice. And you really can see that this pattern looks like it is rotating in space. And we come until this frame 181. And you see this affine now really tries to find here the screwing also in the pattern. And it sticks quite good. Let's make a test quite fast here. With the perspective, it's better or not. Like I've said, sometimes it's trial and error. We see we come close to the same point. I think it's now breaking at this point because now more and more of the background here is coming into the pattern here, and this changes now also the pattern itself. So I think that is quite the whole explanation about the model here. So let's go back to Affine, and I delete everything here again. So if you want to delete it, there's also a keyboard shortcut. Control T is tracking, and if you press Control, I think Shift T, no, Control Alt T. I have forgotten it. Let's check here on clear. There was a keyboard shortcut also for deleting. It's here, clear is Alt T, and if you want to clear backwards, it's Shift Alt T. So Alt T clears everything now to the right. So Alt T, this is now the keyboard shortcut we try to use in future. Okay, let's talk about the rest. The next thing about the pattern here is now we know that the pattern is maybe lit differently. And this happens a lot. And you remember our car was driving in the street scene? We had a shadow on the floor, and this can make a track loose. So what you can do is you can first normalize your footage internally. So changing of luminance is not changing the pattern anymore. It's slower, but it helps in many scenes, and I use it a lot. So normalization of the footage itself is here. Let's go back here and make a fast test again. Control T. You see, takes a little bit longer. But now it runs. Changing here of the light doesn't do anything, but now, like I've said, yeah, the background comes in. Let's talk about more settings here. Let's open these settings again. Correlation is something we talked about before. The margin is something we use later when we have offset tracking and trackers which are coming close to the borders of your plate. So this is the margin. And here is something interesting. This here is the frame limit. What does this mean now? Normally, a tracker takes a pattern in the first keyframe. We talked about these keyframes here. And then it searches in every frame for this pattern. And there are two ways of preventing drifting. And drifting is the biggest problem we have in tracking because the pattern is changing and then suddenly the tracker is moving to the side. One thing is that we stop the tracking process. You've heard that I really often track with my Alt key. So if I go now in here, and let's get rid of that here, and I want to track something accurate, I hold on my Alt key and I go here to the arrow keys and go frame by frame like this here, and I correct directly if I see something. But it takes time. So what you can do is you can say, okay, I want that this tracking process stops after, let's say, 15 frames automatically. So if I now go back, delete everything again here, Control T, you see it tracks and then it stops. Now I check here if the pattern is still good. If I want to make a keyframe here, what you can do is you can press the S key here and you can scale a minimum amount. It's absolutely enough for setting a keyframe, but then I can press Control T again. And you see, we have now here a keyframe. I check again if my pattern is still valid. If I want, I can correct it by pressing the G key as grab here, or I can move here inside. And if I only want to have a keyframe without changing anything, I normally scale it a little bit here and then I press Control T again. So it's half automatic, it stops after amount of frames, and this really often helps in a track. Another thing which you can do, and this is something we do now in a harder scene, is we can tell the system that this pattern has to be changed in every frame. And for this we use the matching model. At the moment, the matching model here is set on keyframes, so only in these yellow keyframes, which I set before, or you also can see them here in this dope sheet representation of our tracking. These are the points where we store the pattern. But if we now go back here, I delete everything here to the right again, and say I want to match in every frame the previous frame, we change the pattern also in every frame. This can help you to track a scene until the end. The problem with this is more and more errors are normally coming to your pattern. And so what I do normally is the thing like here, I have a frame limits on all the time because I want to correct my pattern to get rid of the drifting. If you don't do that, maybe we can see that now here, you will introduce more and more drifting. But you see, you can track much farther. It goes to the end now. But now a part of the pattern is also here, the background of the trees. Maybe that's okay for you. You say, yeah, it holds good. But you see now here, I'm not exactly in the middle of this hole here. Drifting is the biggest problem of this match here. So use this match previous frame only in conjunction with the frame limit. That's my rule of thumb for that. Let's finish now these options here. We talked, I think, about really everything here. I don't see that we have missed something in this list. Motion model match, normalize, correlation, margin. Doesn't help us here, but what the margin, like I've said, does is if you have, for example, let's make an example for that, only to have really everything done. Let's check that here quite fast. Yeah. You track something, for example, here at the border, and let's check maybe that here. I track this pattern here. And if you now track, it will stop to some point because it comes too close here to the border. The problem with this is that if you look now into the curves and I activate that here, only show selected, that you only see the curve here of this pattern. What extremely often happens is that the search area, Alt S, is coming here to the border, and the tracker in the last frames here, because the pattern comes so close here to the border, suddenly it starts moving. So borders are something which you have to keep in mind here for this problem. So here you see sometimes you get a little bit of misinformation here. To avoid that, what you can do is you can set here a margin of, for example, 5 pixels. So if you have that, this tracker is stopping 5 pixels before the whole thing. And here it was not enough. Let's make it bigger. Let's say 20 pixels. And you see here it is stopped then. This can be useful if you have something which is close to a border or so. Let's switch now the shot itself. So I think we have talked about everything here. Command N, VFX. No, we don't need to save that. Let's go into our footage, and this time we take from our footage the plane track, the green laptop again. We had that before. I want to demonstrate something here. So let's set the scene frames and prefetch it. Okay. And you see here on the laptop we have these tracking markers here, which help me later to place an insert here inside of this area. And the idea is good, but what you also see is that these tracking markers here are really often inside of a motion blurred area. The contrast is not very high, and this can make a problem later into your tracking process. If you go now back and we try now with our tracking know-how here, the whole thing, we go to correlation 0.9, we say what is the movement of the whole thing. We have perspective here because I walk around the laptop, so the motion model is now affine or even perspective. Let's try affine here. 90% is good, we don't leave the frame, so let's go back and try now first to track, let's say, this guy here in the middle. So I make here now something like that. Here we can go to the middle. What I also do a lot, if you have a better footage and a better green screen, I don't go into the middle of a cross. Really often here the edges are much better to track, but in our case here this tracking mark is really fine, so I'm happy if I am somehow inside of the cross at the end. So we do that. Then we go into our tracking settings, normalize on, because I think the lighting conditions are changing. And what I also want to do is I go here to real time and I want to stop the tracking process every 15 frames. So let's Control T that. And now you see we are going to this point. Now I would normally correct the whole thing, press Command T again, and now you see what I've told you. This is now extremely blurry, and I'm happy that it stopped after 15 frames. And now you see I can go through that here. This manual approach of tracking seems to work for that, and now we suddenly lose it. Why? Because here suddenly the pattern has changed a lot, so press Alt and the arrows to the right. Now we can see that we can squeeze some more out of that. A footage like this here, we can let Blender track something different than we see. I go back here now, set my frame limit to 0 because I want to make a test. I delete everything here and I now say track it. And you will see that we lose this pattern around frame 48. Let's go back. Like I've said, really often we use contrasty points, or all the time we use contrasty points to track something. And this contrast maybe is not high enough. So what we can try now is we can try now to find a better contrasty look of that. We talked about that in the absolutely first lesson, where I told you about video preparation, so color adjustments and things like that. But we also can have color adjustments here. You see here that we have our 3 channels and black and white. You also remember that we track that here, which is not exactly like the thing here. This is maybe pixelated, this here is always interpolated. So if we go here to black and white, you see it looks like that here. Then we can go into the different channels, and you now see that we can now try to find a better solution for the whole thing. You can do it here if you like, but really often before I do that, I make a test first on the full plate. And for this, we can go here to the clip displays. If we now use it here, you see that the whole plate is now changed in the color appearance, which helps you also to find sometimes good points which you maybe want to track. And what I want to point out now is that if you have footage and it comes from a digital source, really often you have grain in it or even compression artifacts. The most compression artifacts we normally have in the blue channel, So if we go here to blue and we scrub that, you see it's flickering, it's noisy, and it's really hell to find a pattern here. But also in other channels you maybe find that. And what you now can do is you can try to find a good combination for the next track you do. If you say, I want to have here the crosses better, look at that. If you have a combination of, for example, red and green, these crosses here are much more visible than before. It's easier to track. And with this knowledge now, red and green, you can go here and say the same thing here. We only want to have red and green here. And then you go back and track. That's the basic idea behind that. Okay, I think that's it for this introduction here to the advanced settings. I promised you a hard job. So let's go here and take a look here at this Waldbrunnen idea, which we have. I used frame 50 to, let's check here, the last one, frame 200. So let's take a look here into that footage. This was an extremely cheap camera and it's flickering a lot. We have compression artifacts and things like that. And what you can do now here is really to test how you can track points here now on this object here. We also have a motion blur going on, and if you really go close here, you see it's a really hard tracking job to do, but this is a good practice now to do. And I hope you learned something in this lesson. If you have questions, please write in the comments below. If you like that, give me a thumbs up and subscribe. And I will see you in the next lesson where we get again a little bit more practice also with the compositor. So have fun until this. Your Helge Maus.